In the summer of 1944, there was a question that every soldier in Normandy learned to ask himself. Not, "Will I die?" That question had an answer, and the answer was probably yes. The real question, the one that kept you awake in your foxhole while artillery rumbled in the distance, was this: what sound tells you that death has found you? Most men got it wrong. They'd say the whistle of incoming shells, the scream of the Nebelwerfer rockets the Germans called screaming mimes, the rattle of an MG-42 machine gun that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute and turn a man into mist. They were all wrong. The sound that meant you were already dead was silence. The particular kind of silence that fell when a Tiger tank's turret stopped moving. When 70 tons of German steel and mathematics locked its 88mm cannon onto a point in space that you currently occupied. In that frozen heartbeat between motion and stillness, every other sound in the universe vanished. Your heartbeat, your breathing, the wind through the leaves, gone. Just you and that black circle of steel, and the certainty that the laws of physics were about to work against you. Private First Class Elliot Whitmore heard that silence at 0730 hours on July 9th, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy looked nothing like a battlefield. If you'd never seen them, if you were looking at photographs back in the States, you'd think they were the kind of pastoral French countryside that belonged on a postcard. Ancient walls of earth and stone, crowned with hawthorn and oak, dividing fields that had been farmed since before America existed. Beautiful, if you ignored the corpses. The bocage, the French called it. The locals had spent 1,000 years building these earthen barriers to mark property lines and keep cattle from wandering. It took the 29th Infantry Division exactly 3 days to learn that the bocage was the perfect defensive terrain. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was a kill box. Every gap in the hedge was a place where good men went to die. Elliot crouched behind one of these walls, his M1 Garand rifle gripped so tight his knuckles had gone bloodless. He was 19 years old and looked 16, smooth-faced except for the pathetic attempt at sideburns that weren't fooling anybody. The army had issued him a helmet that sat too low on his head, constantly sliding forward over the thick-rimmed glasses he had to push back up his nose every 30 seconds. 7 months ago, he'd been studying thermodynamic equations at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. His biggest worry had been the midterm exam on heat transfer coefficients. Now he was learning the coefficient of fear, measured in heartbeats per second while waiting for death. The morning air was cool still, maybe 82 degrees, but the humidity made it feel like breathing through wet cloth. The smell was complex. Crushed apples from an orchard that had been shelled into splinters, cordite residue from the firefight at dawn, diesel exhaust. And underneath it all, the sweet, sick smell of death that you never got used to no matter how many times you encountered it. Sergeant Dutch Brenner moved down the line of men pressed against the hedgerow. He was 42, with a face that looked carved from old boot leather. 3 years into this war, and he developed the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. His Thompson submachine gun was an extension of his arms. He'd been carrying it so long he probably slept with it. He knelt beside Elliot. "You good, Specs?" The nickname had stuck after a mortar fragment destroyed Elliot's spare glasses, and he'd spent 2 days squinting like a mole. The squad thought it was hilarious. Elliot thought it beat Professor, which made him sound like he was lecturing them. "Defining good is subjective, Sergeant." "That's a no." Brenner pointed through a gap in the brush. "Tiger tank, 200 yards up that lane, blocking the crossroads. Battalion needs it gone by 2100 hours tonight, or they're calling in strategic bombers to level this whole sector." Elliot felt his stomach drop. With us in it? War doesn't care about details, Specs. Through the leaves, Elliot could see it. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger Ausf E. Even the German designation sounded like a death sentence. He'd studied the specifications in training. 88mm KWK 36 main gun. Effective range against armor, 2,000 meters. Frontal armor, 100mm at 25 degrees slope. Powered by a Maybach HL230P45 engine, producing 700 horsepower. Combat weight, 56.9 metric tons. On paper, it was fascinating engineering. In person, it was a dragon. "Bazooka team," Brenner ordered. 2 men scrambled forward. Private First Class Red Henshaw, a kid from Kentucky with hair the color of rust and a smile that belonged on a baseball field, not a battlefield. He was the loader. The gunner was an older man, maybe 35, with the steady hands of someone who'd done this before and somehow survived. Elliot watched them position the M1A1 rocket launcher. His mind automatically ran the calculations. Bazooka rocket, M6A3. Muzzle velocity, 270 feet per second. Maximum effective range against armor, 150 yards. Penetration against rolled homogeneous steel, 4.7 inches at 0 degrees impact angle. The Tiger's frontal armor was 3.9 inches thick at 25 degrees slope, which meant effective thickness, after accounting for the angle, was about 4.3 inches. The math said it should work. Elliot had been in France long enough to know that math was a liar. "Target acquired," the gunner whispered. The loader slid the rocket into the tube. "Backblast area clear." Nobody breathed. Somewhere a bird was singing, ignorant of mathematics and violence. Whoosh! The rocket screamed across the 200 yards on a tail of grey smoke. Elliot tracked it with his eyes, watched it strike the Tiger's glacis plate at a shallow angle. The impact produced a flash of orange, a bang that echoed off the hedgerows. Then silence. The smoke cleared. There was a black scorch mark on the German steel. Nothing more. The rocket had struck, transferred its kinetic energy, and failed. The shaped charge had failed to penetrate. The laws of physics, for once, had sided with the Germans. For exactly 2 seconds, nothing happened. The Tiger sat there, engine idling, morning light gleaming on armor that was pristine except for one small mark that said the Americans had tried and failed. Then the turret began to traverse. The whine of the electric motors was the sound of inevitability arriving on schedule. Slow, deliberate. The kind of motion that said, "We have all the time in the world, and you have none." "Move! Fall back!" Brenner's voice shattered the frozen moment. The bazooka team abandoned their weapon, diving into the ditch. Elliot was already running, his body reacting before his brain caught up, legs pumping, boots slipping on mud and roots. The Tiger's main gun fired. The high-explosive shell didn't land where Elliot expected. It slammed into the earthen embankment, 20 feet to his left. The hedgerow, which had stood there since the 1600s, which had survived the 100 Years' War and the Revolution and the First World War, disintegrated. Earth and stone and vegetation erupted upward in a column of violence that turned noon into twilight. The pressure wave picked Elliot up like a toy and hurled him backward. He hit the ground hard enough to see stars, tasted copper and dirt, felt something wet running from his nose. His glasses were gone. The world became a watercolor painting, all blurred edges and uncertain shapes. Somewhere in the chaos, the Tiger's hull-mounted MG-42 opened fire. 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was like industrial fabric being torn by a giant, amplified and multiplied and made terrible. The tracers looked like green fireflies, beautiful and deadly. Hands grabbed Elliot's collar. Someone was dragging him. He couldn't hear who, couldn't see, just felt himself being hauled through mud and over roots while the world died around him. They ran until legs gave out and lungs burned, ran until the sound of the machine gun faded into the distance, collapsed finally in the ruins of a barn half a mile behind the line. Elliot found his spare glasses in his breast pocket, bent but intact. He put them on, and the world snapped back into focus, though he wished it hadn't. Red Henshaw was on the ground, both hands pressed to his stomach, dark blood seeping between his fingers, too much blood, the kind of blood that meant internal damage that a field dressing couldn't fix. He wasn't screaming. That was the worst part. He was quiet, eyes wide with the understanding that his body had been broken beyond repair. The man who dragged Elliot back was Sergeant Hank Kellerman, 48 years old, built like a concrete block wrapped in muscle, with hands that were permanently stained with grease no amount of scrubbing could touch. Before the war, he'd been a foreman at a Packard plant in Detroit, supervising the men who welded automotive frames. Now he supervised men who were trying not to become casualties. Everyone called him Grease. He knelt beside Red, checked the wound, and his jaw tightened. He looked at Brenner and gave a small shake of his head. The gesture said everything words couldn't. "We need to evacuate him," Corporal Mitch O'Hara said. He was 31, from Boston, drove a Jeep, and had a wife and 2 kids whose photographs he kept in a waterproof pouch. His hands were shaking as he talked. "We need to get him to the aid station right now." "Can't move him through that crossroads," Brenner said. His voice was flat, scraped clean of emotion by necessity. Not with that tiger sitting there. The barn they'd taken refuge in had been beautiful once. Stone walls 2 feet thick, a peaked roof with hand-hewn beams. Now the roof was gone, blown away by artillery in June, leaving the interior exposed to the grey sky. The walls were pocked with bullet holes. It smelled of old hay and cordite, and something rotten nobody wanted to identify. This was their forward operating base, their garage, their aid station, their home. Grease stood up from Red's side, walked to the corner where a Jeep Willys sat, with its front axle snapped clean through like a broken bone. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he kicked the tire with enough force to rock the entire vehicle. Useless. His voice was like gravel grinding in a cement mixer, the product of 30 years of cigarettes and assembly line work. "Everything we got is tin cans." He kicked the tire again. "We're throwing tin cans at a moving castle." Elliot sat on an ammunition crate, head in his hands. His ears were still ringing from the shell burst. His hands were shaking, and he couldn't make them stop. He'd done the calculations, the penetration values. The rocket should have worked, except it hadn't, and now Red was dying, and all the thermodynamics equations he'd memorized at Caltech couldn't change that fact. Mitch was pacing, talking rapidly to nobody in particular, the way nervous men talk when silence means thinking, and thinking means understanding how bad things really are. "We can't go back there. That's suicide. That tiger's dug in. Perfect line of sight, perfect position. We go back with bazookas. We just add more names to the casualty list. We need air support, artillery, armor. Something that's not us walking up to that thing with rockets that bounce off like spitballs." Brenner was on the field telephone, the handset pressed to his ear, his face getting redder with each passing second. "Yes, sir, I understand the timetable. I'm telling you, we tried a direct assault. It failed. We need—" "Yes, sir. I know about the cloud cover. Yes, sir, understood." He hung up with enough force to crack the plastic housing. "No air support. Weather's too low for bombers. No artillery. Everything's committed to the Veer push. No armor. The Shermans are bogged down 3 miles east dealing with their own tigers." He looked at his men, looked at Red bleeding out on the floor. "We take that crossroads by 2100 hours with what we've got, or Strategic Air Command levels this entire sector at 0600 tomorrow. With us in it." The silence that followed had physical weight. Mitch broke it. "That's 13 hours from now." "I can count, Corporal. 13 hours to figure out how to kill something that can't be killed with anything we have." Grease pulled an unlit cigar from his pocket, put it in the corner of his mouth where it belonged. Elliot had never seen him actually light one. The cigar was just part of his face, like the grease stains on his hands. "Unless somebody's got a miracle in their back pocket," Grease said, "we're dead men walking." The miracle arrived at 1000 hours, dragged into the barn by 2 mud-caked scouts who looked like they'd been wrestling pigs. They hauled it across the threshold and dropped it on the dirt floor with a heavy metallic thud. "German Goliath mine," one of them said, breathing hard. "Found it in a ditch about a kilometer back. Control wires cut. Damn thing's dead weight." Elliot stood up, curiosity momentarily overriding exhaustion. He walked over to examine it. The Goliath was ugly in the way military equipment was often ugly. Function without aesthetics. About 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, riding on miniature tank tracks. A metal box painted in German field grey, with a hollow compartment in the center where explosives would be loaded. The Leichte Ladungsträger Goliath. Light charge carrier. The Germans used them for demolition work, blowing bridges, clearing minefields, remote-controlled death on tracks. Grease walked around it, examined the track assembly, the motor housing. He'd seen these before. Electric motors, battery-powered. They drag a mile of cable behind them for control, move slower than my grandmother walking to church on Sunday. He spat on the ground. Useless junk. But Elliot wasn't listening. He was looking at the track system, at the electric drive motors, at the servo mechanisms for steering. His engineering student brain was already making connections, seeing possibilities where others saw scrap. He crouched down, ran his fingers over the motor housing, pulled out the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket, the one filled with equations and diagrams from Caltech, started sketching. The problem, he said, mostly to himself, isn't the concept, it's the execution. Grease turned around. Say again? Elliot looked up, his eyes focusing on something beyond the barn walls. The Goliath fails because of friction and control vulnerability. Tracks have high surface area contact with the ground. More contact means more friction. More friction means you need more torque. More torque means lower speed, and the cable control is a single point of failure. Snag it on debris, the whole system's dead. He was talking faster now, the words tumbling out as his mind raced ahead. But if we eliminate the tracks, replace them with wheels, pneumatic rubber tires, we reduce the coefficient of rolling friction by a factor of 4, maybe 5. Same motor power, drastically less resistance. We could make it fast, really fast. Grease frowned. Fast doesn't help if you can't steer the damn thing. Radio control, not cable, radio frequency transmission. Mitch laughed, but there was an edge of hysteria in it. Radio? Specs, the reception out here is garbage. We can barely pick up the BBC on a clear night. Not long-range broadcast, short-range, line-of-sight control. Maybe 200 yards maximum effective range. We cannibalize a field radio for the receiver circuit, use the Goliath's servos for steering, mount everything on a wheeled chassis. He pointed at the broken Jeep in the corner. We salvage the suspension from that, the wheels, build a light frame, make it fast and maneuverable. He held up his notebook, showing the rough sketch he'd drawn. It looked like something a child might draw. A Jeep Willys shrunk down to toy size, stripped of everything human, with a rectangular box in the center where a payload would go. We load it with high explosives, drive it via radio control directly under the Tiger's belly. The ventral armor is the weakest point, 3.1 inches, maybe less at the weld seams. 50 pounds of composition B, detonated from below, the blast vector goes straight up into the crew compartment and ammunition storage. He looked at Grease, then at Brenner. It's a guaranteed kill. The barn went completely silent. Even Red's labored breathing seemed to pause. Grease walked up to Elliot, looked down at him. The sergeant had a full head of height and probably 80 pounds of muscle on the skinny college kid. You want to build a toy car? Yes. Load it with enough explosives to level this barn? Yes. And drive it by radio control into the belly of a Tiger tank? Yes. Grease stared at him for a long moment. Then he took the notebook, studied the sketch more carefully. His eyes tracked the lines, the proportions, the rough calculations scribbled in the margins. He handed it back. You're completely out of your damn mind. Elliot swallowed. Probably. I like it. Brenner stepped forward, his command presence filling the barn. Absolutely not. We're not building some college science project when we should be planning a real assault. Elliot turned to face him. His voice came out steadier than he felt. With what, Sergeant? The bazookas that bounced off? The air support that's not coming? The tanks that are somewhere else fighting their own battles? He gestured toward Red, whose breathing was getting shallower. We go back in there with conventional weapons, we're just adding more casualties. Watch your tone, Private. I'm watching 30 men die, Sergeant, including me. The field telephone rang. Brenner grabbed it. Brenner. Yes. When did this happen? How many? His face went pale. Understood, sir. He hung up slowly, the handset resting in the cradle like it weighed 50 pounds. That Tiger killed 2 more Shermans this morning. 75th Tank Battalion. Both tanks destroyed at 1,500 yards. The crews never saw it coming. 8 men dead. He looked at the faces in the barn. There are no tank replacements available. No armor support is coming. No air cover. No artillery, just us, and whatever we can improvise. The weight of those words settled over them like a burial shroud. Brenner walked over to Elliot's sketch, studied it for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, still hard, still authoritative, but with a crack in it that said he was out of options. "Can you actually build this?" Grease pulled the cigar from his mouth, examined it like it held divine wisdom. "I've got 2 starter motors from the wrecked GMC out back. High torque, 12 volt. I can weld a tube frame from angle iron. Use the Goliath servos, wire them to the radio receiver." He looked at Elliot. "His math, my metal." "How long?" "Honest answer, never done anything remotely like this. Could take 6 hours. Could take all 13 we've got." Brenner checked his watch. 1,000 hours. 11 hours until deadline. "You've got until 2100. 11 hours. If that thing isn't ready to demonstrate by the time the sun sets, you're both carrying the lead bazooka tomorrow morning at dawn. Crystal clear?" "Crystal," Grease said. "O'Hara," Brenner turned to Mitch. "You're on supply run. They need parts, you find them. Strip every vehicle from here to Utah Beach if you have to." "Yes, Sergeant." "Rest of you, perimeter security. That tiger knows we're here. He might send infantry to probe our position." The men dispersed to their tasks. Elliot stood there holding his notebook, suddenly aware of what he'd just committed to, what they'd all committed to. The weight of it pressed down on his shoulders. Grease grabbed him by the arm, steered him toward the pile of scrap metal in the corner. "All right, Professor, you do the thinking. I'll do the welding. And you better pray your college professors taught you something useful, because if this fails, we're all digging our own graves." Outside, the temperature was rising. The humidity made the air feel like soup. The smell was shifting. Less cordite now, more diesel, more death. And somewhere up that sunken lane, 56.9 tons of German steel sat, waiting, patient as a spider in its web, confident that physics and armor would protect it from anything the Americans could throw. The clock was ticking. 11 hours to build a miracle, or die at dawn. The scavenging began at 10:30 hours. Mitch O'Hara climbed into his Jeep, Elliot in the passenger seat with his notebook open, making lists of components they'd need. Grease stayed behind, already clearing workspace in the barn, dragging the Goliath to the center of the floor like a surgeon prepping an operating table. The temperature had climbed to 90 degrees, the kind of heat that made sweat run constantly, that turned uniforms into wet rags, that made thinking feel like wading through molasses. But there was no time to care about comfort. "Where first?" Mitch asked, one hand on the steering wheel, the other unconsciously touching the photograph in his pocket. His wife Sarah, his daughters Margaret and Anne, 8 and 6 years old. He'd promised them he'd come home. "The truck graveyard," Elliot said. "We need starter motors." They found the wrecks a quarter-mile behind the line, a collection of vehicles that had driven to the war and stopped, some killed by artillery, some by mines, some simply broken by the brutal mathematics of supply lines and maintenance schedules. A GMCCCKW truck, what the men called a deuce and a half, for its 2.5-ton capacity, sat nose down in a ditch. Artillery had found it 2 days ago. The cargo bed was gone, blown to kindling. The cab was crushed. But, miraculously, the engine compartment was intact. Elliot climbed onto the twisted frame. Starter motors, 2 of them. They're essentially high-torque DC motors, 12 volt, designed to spin a flywheel against the compression of 6 cylinders, more than enough power to drive wheels. He found the first one still bolted to the engine block, cast iron housing, heavy, about the size of a large coffee can. Inside, an armature would spin at high RPM when voltage was applied. Simple, reliable, powerful. Mitch handed him a socket wrench. They worked in silence, loosening bolts that didn't want to loosen, disconnecting wiring that had corroded. We dripped off Elliot's nose, fogging his glasses. He had to stop every minute to wipe them clean. The second starter motor came from another truck 50 yards down. 20 minutes of work, 20 minutes closer to the deadline. "Suspension next," Elliot said, checking his list. "We need the front suspension assembly from a Jeep. The A-arms, coil springs, steering linkages, everything." Mitch knew every vehicle in the graveyard, knew which ones had parts worth salvaging, which ones were too far gone. This one, he pointed to a Willis with the entire rear section missing, probably from a mine. Front ends solid. They worked with a sledgehammer and pry bar. Brutal, physical labor, the kind that made muscles scream and hands blister. But there was something almost meditative about it. The rhythm of metal on metal, the gradual yielding of parts that hadn't been designed to come apart in a muddy field in France. By 1200 hours, they had 4 wheels with pneumatic tires, 2 complete suspension assemblies, and a collection of springs and hardware that might or might not fit together. The radio, Elliot said. This was trickier. The SCR 300 field radio was critical communications equipment. Cannibalizing one was the kind of thing that could earn a court-martial in peacetime. But these weren't peacetimes. Mitch knew where the broken radios were kept, the ones stripped for parts when field repairs failed. They found one in the signal corps tent. The vacuum tubes were intact. The receiver circuit was functional, just needed a new power transformer that supply hadn't sent yet. Elliot carefully extracted the components, wrapping them in cloth like they were made of crystal, which, in a sense, they were. Vacuum tubes were glass. Drop one, and you'd have to start over. By 1300 hours, they'd hauled everything back to the barn. Grease had been busy. He'd cleared the center of the space, set up an acetylene welding rig, arranged his tools with the precision of a craftsman who'd spent 3 decades working metal for a living. Hammers arranged by weight, wrenches in order of size. Everything had a place. He looked at the pile of salvaged parts like Michelangelo looking at a block of marble. "All right, Professor, walk me through the theory." Elliot opened his notebook to the detailed sketches he'd been refining. The chassis needs to be light, but structurally rigid. I'm thinking tubular steel frame, welded construction. The starter motors mount here and here on the rear axle, 1 per wheel, direct drive, no transmission. We're sacrificing torque multiplication for simplicity and weight savings. The front wheels are passive, controlled only by steering. Grease studied the drawings. Weight distribution's going to be arse-heavy with those motors in back. That's acceptable. We want weight on the drive wheels for traction. The explosives in the center will balance it out. How much explosive are we talking? 50 pounds. Composition B. Grease whistled low. That's enough to turn this barn into sawdust. That's the idea. And detonation? Primary system is an impact fuse mounted on the front bumper. Copper blasting cap. When it hits something solid at velocity, inertia triggers a firing pin. Backup is radio-controlled. Red button on the control box. Grease lit his torch. The flame bloomed blue-white, hissing like an angry serpent. The smell of burning acetylene filled the barn, sharp and acrid. Then we better make sure it hits what we're aiming at. The work began at 1330 hours. Grease cut angle iron with the torch. Each cut measured twice, executed once. Old habits from the assembly line, where a 1/16 of an inch could mean the difference between a car that drove smooth and one that rattled itself apart at 50 miles per hour. The metal glowed orange under the flame, throwing sparks that died on the dirt floor like tiny meteors. Each cut was clean, professional, the work of a man who understood that metal had a memory and would remember if you treated it wrong. Elliot worked on the electronics. He spread the radio components on a clean tarp, the vacuum tubes lined up like a surgeon's instruments. The receiver circuit had to be modified to accept steering commands from the control box he'd built. He soldered connections with hands that were steadier now, the fear burned away by the focus of creation. Mitch shuttled between them, holding frame pieces while Grease welded, running for tools, for wire, for anything they needed. He talked while he worked, a stream of nervous consciousness. Sarah's going to kill me when I tell her about this. If I get to tell her. Her last letter, she thinks I'm doing supply runs. Safe, rear echelon work. Didn't have the heart to tell her I'm building a robot bomb in a barn while a Tiger tank sits 200 yards away. Less talking, more holding, Grease said, his voice muffled behind the welding mask. The frame took shape slowly. 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, a skeleton of tubular steel that looked fragile but was stronger than it appeared. Simple geometry. A rectangle with cross braces and mounting points. Beauty in functionality. By 1600 hours, the basic chassis was complete. Grease killed the torch, stepped back, wiped sweat from his forehead with a rag that was black with soot. The frame glowed dull red in the afternoon light filtering through the ruined roof. Not bad for government work. The sun was past its zenith now, starting the long slide toward evening. Someone had rigged up work lights powered by a portable generator that chugged outside. The lights cast harsh shadows, turned the workspace into a stage where the only show was life versus death. At 1700 hours, they mounted the starter motors. This was critical. The motors had to align perfectly with the rear axle. The coupling had to be solid. When voltage hit those motors, they'd try to spin at thousands of RPM. Any wobble, any misalignment, and the whole assembly would shake itself apart. Grease fabricated mounting brackets from scrap steel, welding them to the frame with the precision that came from muscle memory. Each weld was perfect, each joint sound. While he worked, Elliot explained the physics. The Goliath fails because it fights friction. Steel tracks on Earth. The coefficient of rolling resistance is approximately 0.05. That means 5% of the vehicle weight is constantly working against forward motion. Pneumatic tires on firm ground, coefficient drops to 0.01. 1%. We're reducing resistance by a factor of 5. He drew diagrams in his notebook. Same input power, 1/5 the resistance. Newton's second law. Force equals mass times acceleration. Same force, less resistance, higher acceleration. The math says we can hit 30 miles per hour, maybe more. Grease tightened the bolt, testing the motor mount. In English, Professor. Wheels make it fast. Fast means the tiger can't track us with the gun. Why didn't you just say that? Because understanding the principles means we can troubleshoot when something goes wrong. When, not if. Always assume something will go wrong. Plan for it. At 1830 hours, they had the rolling chassis complete. 4 wheels, 2 motors, a frame. It sat on the barn floor, looking like an oversized child's toy, built by someone with access to industrial tools. Now came the brain. Elliot took the servo motors from the Goliath, small electric actuators that could turn a shaft left or right on command. German engineering, overbuilt in that way Germans overbuilt everything. He mounted them to the front axle, connected them to the steering linkages using tension cables salvaged from a bicycle. Mechanical advantage, he explained to Mitch, who was watching. The servo doesn't have to be powerful if we use leverage correctly. The cable runs through this pulley system, 2-to-1 ratio. The servo rotates 10 degrees, the wheel turns 20. Simple machines, Grease said from across the barn. Simple machines win wars. The receiver circuit went into a wooden box Elliot built from ammunition crate slats. Careful work with a coping saw and wood glue. Not pretty, but functional. He wired the servos to the output terminals, checked each connection 3 times. 1 reversed wire, and the steering would go backward. At 1900 hours, they encountered their first serious problem: power distribution. The starter motors needed 12 volts at high amperage to spin fast. The radio receiver needed 6 volts at low amperage for the vacuum tubes. Running both off the same battery would cause voltage sag, brownouts, unpredictable behavior. We need isolated power systems, Elliot said. 2 6-volt batteries in series for the drive motors, separate 6-volt battery for the receiver. And we need voltage regulation so the receiver stays stable when the motors draw heavy current. Mitch ran to find batteries, came back with 3 6-volt units from a Signal Corps truck. Elliot wired 2 in series for 12 volts drive power. The third powered the receiver through a voltage regulator he improvised from spare components. The smell in the barn was changing with the hours. The sharp acetylene had faded. Now it was solder flux, that sweet, acrid smell of melting rosin, sweat and cigarette smoke, and the ever-present odor of grease that seemed to leak from Grease himself. At 2000 hours, Brenner came to check progress. He stood at the edge of the workspace, watching them work under the harsh lights. Didn't speak for a long time, just watched Grease weld a battery mount. Watched Elliot test the servo response with a multimeter. Watched Mitch hold a work light steady. Finally, "You really think this'll work?" Grease didn't look up. "Ask me in an hour." "I'm asking now." Elliot turned around. His face was smudged with soot. His glasses had a hairline crack in one lens he hadn't noticed until now. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 9 hours. Theoretically, yes. We're reducing friction, eliminating the cable vulnerability, using high-power motors for speed. The Tiger's belly armor is its weakest structural point. 50 pounds of Comp B detonated from below, the blast vector goes straight up. Pressure wave ruptures the hull, ignites ammunition, kills the crew. He paused. On paper, it works. And off paper? Off paper, Sergeant, we won't know until we try. Brenner nodded slowly. Red's still alive, barely. Medic says every hour he waits, his chances drop. So you better make sure this works. He left without another word. The night deepened. Outside, the sounds of war continued. Artillery rumbling in the distance like eternal thunder. Rifle fire crackling somewhere to the east. The drone of aircraft too high to identify. Inside the barn, there was only the steady rhythm of work. Metal on metal, solder on circuit boards. The quiet sounds of desperate men building something that had never existed. At 2100 hours, Mitch brought K-rations and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a boot. They ate standing up, too dirty to care, fueling their bodies so they could finish fueling the machine. At 2200 hours, the control box was complete. Wooden case, about the size of a shoebox, 2 toggle switches on the face panel, one for forward, reverse thrust, one for left-right steering, a dial from a radio tuner for fine control, and under a hinged safety cover, a red button that looked serious, because it was. Elliot held it, feeling the weight. It felt heavier than wood and wire should feel, weighted with responsibility and consequences. The antenna, he said. The antenna was 8 feet of copper wire, mounted vertically on the rear of the chassis. It would receive radio signals from the control box, translate invisible electromagnetic waves into electrical current, command the servos, drive the motors. Everything depended on that wire catching the right signals out of the air. At 22:30 hours, they were ready for the first test. The machine sat in the center of the barn, 4 wheels on dirt, motors connected, servos mounted, antenna standing vertical like a flagpole. It didn't have a name yet, didn't look like much, just scrap metal and salvaged parts, held together with welds and mathematics. Elliot picked up the control box. His hands were shaking again, but differently now. Not fear, anticipation. The moment when theory meets reality, and you discover if you're a genius or a fool. Grease and Mitch stepped back, giving it room. Brenner stood in the shadows, arms crossed. Elliot flipped the power switch. Red light glowed. He could hear the hum of the receiver circuit, feel the slight vibration of active electronics. "Here goes everything," he whispered. He pushed the forward toggle. Heartbeat pause. Then both rear wheels spun, motors engaging with a sharp electric whine. The machine lurched forward, accelerating faster than he'd calculated. It shot across the barn floor, wheels kicking up dust, heading straight for the far wall. "Left!" Mitch yelled. Elliot cranked the steering dial left. Static erupted from the control box. The antenna sparked orange. The machine jerked hard right, completely ignoring the command. The front wheels turned the wrong direction. It slammed into a stack of ammunition crates at full velocity. The crash was catastrophic. Wood exploded into splinters. Metal shrieked. The machine flipped onto its side, wheels still spinning, motors screaming. Sparks shot from the battery connections. Smoke rose from somewhere in the electrical system. Elliot killed the power. The motors died. The barn fell into shocked silence, except for the clatter of debris settling. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Grease walked over, grabbed the chassis, flipped it upright with a grunt. One wheel was bent at an angle. The front axle had twisted. Wires hung loose like severed nerves. He looked at Elliot, then at the clock. 22:45. They had 8 hours and 15 minutes until deadline. "Well," Grease said, his voice carefully neutral, "that didn't go as planned." Brenner stepped forward. "That's it? That's what you've been building all night? A toy that crashes into walls?" Elliot was staring at the wreckage, his mind racing through the failure analysis. The generator. Outside. The spark plugs are creating broadband electromagnetic interference. Same frequency band as our receiver. The signal's getting scrambled. The steering commands are being drowned out by noise. In English specs. The generator is accidentally jamming our radio control. Then shut it off.
We need it for the work lights.
Then fix it another way. You've got 8 hours. Grease was already examining the bent wheel, the twisted axle. This is repairable. Straighten the wheel, re-weld the mount. 30 minutes. He looked at Elliot. But the interference problem is yours. Elliot opened the control box, stared at the circuit board. His hands were shaking badly now. 8 hours. Not enough. The math said it wasn't enough.
But the math also said the bazooka should have worked, and it hadn't.
Sometimes math lied, and you had to improvise. He thought about his electromagnetic theory professor at Caltech, Dr. Morrison, who'd spent 3 lectures on radio frequency interference and how to mitigate it. The lectures had seemed theoretical and useless at the time. Nothing was useless now. I need a large capacitor and an inductor coil.
We can build an LC filter, tune it to our control frequency, attenuate the interference.
Mitch was already moving. Where do I find that? The signal core tent. Look for damaged radios. Strip the power supply sections. While Mitch ran, Elliot pulled the receiver circuit from the control box, laid it on a clean workbench. Grease worked on the mechanical damage, straightening the wheel with a hammer, the steady clang, clang, clang echoing through the barn. The sound was almost comforting,
proof that repair was possible, that failure wasn't final.
Mitch returned 10 minutes later with components. Elliot's hands were steady again, the shaking burned away by focus. He soldered the capacitor into the circuit, added an inductor coil wound from copper wire. Basic LC filter design. Textbook stuff that suddenly mattered more than any exam ever had. LC filter, he explained while he worked. Inductor and capacitor create a resonance circuit.
Tuned to our control frequency, it passes that frequency with minimal loss while blocking everything else.
The interference from the generator is mainly high-frequency noise. This filter acts like earplugs for the receiver. It can hear what we're saying and ignore everything else. Grease was welding the axle mount, blue-white light flashing. You college boys and your magic circuits. Not magic. Just Maxwell's equations applied correctly. Maxwell can go to hell if it doesn't work.
At 0-100 hours, they'd rebuilt the machine, straightened the damage, rewired the circuits, added the filter. It sat on the barn floor again, looking slightly battle-worn but fundamentally sound. Elliot held the control box. His mouth was dry. His heart was hammering against his ribs. This was the moment. If it failed again, there was no time for a third attempt. He flipped the power switch. Red light. Steady glow. The hum of electronics. He pushed the forward toggle. The motors engaged smoothly. The machine rolled forward in a straight line. 10 feet. 20 feet. Controlled. Responsive. He turned the dial left. The front wheels turned left. The machine curved in a graceful arc. No hesitation, no confusion. Right. Instant response. The machine zigzagged, precise and controlled. He brought it back to center, stopped it right in front of him. Perfect control, perfect response. Behind him, he heard Mitch exhale a breath he'd been holding for probably a minute. Grease walked over, examined the machine, looked at Elliot. For the first time since they'd started, he smiled. I'll be damned. The professor actually did it. Brenner stepped into the light. His face had changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something that might have been hope. It works. It works, Elliot confirmed. Top speed. 30 miles per hour on flat ground, maybe more. How long until it's combat ready?
We need to load the explosives, fabricate the detonator system, test it one more time. 3 hours. Brenner checked his watch. Do it. We move at 0500. That gives you 4 hours, and you'll need every minute. The loading of the explosives began at 0200 hours. The Composition B came in 1-pound blocks, wrapped in wax paper, stamped with warnings in 3 languages. Malleable like clay,
smelling faintly of almonds. Elliot packed it carefully into the central compartment, pressing it tight against the frame, each block positioned to maximize the blast vector. 50 pounds, enough high explosive to turn a Sherman tank inside out. The copper blasting cap went on the front bumper, connected to a simple mechanical impact fuse. Spring-loaded firing pin. Hit something hard enough, fast enough, the inertia would drive the pin into the cap. The cap would detonate the main charge. Simple, reliable, final. The backup detonator was more complex. A small radio receiver wired to an electric blasting cap buried in the center of the explosive mass. If the impact fuse failed, if they needed manual control, Elliot could press the red button and send the signal that would end everything. Grease checked every connection twice, hands that had welded 1,000 car frames now handling enough explosive to level a city block. "One mistake here," he said quietly, "and they'll be scraping us off these walls. Then we don't make mistakes." At 0330 hours, they conducted the final test. Elliot drove the machine in figure eights around the barn. Fast, slow, sharp turns, emergency stops. Everything worked. The motors were strong. The steering was responsive. The control was precise. At 0400 hours, it was time to move. 4 men carried the machine like pallbearers, through the ruined barn doors into the pre-dawn darkness. The temperature had dropped to maybe 78 degrees. The air was cool on sweat-soaked skin. The smell was wet grass and diesel and that peculiar clarity that comes just before sunrise. They moved through the hedgerows in silence. No talking, no lights, just the sound of boots on earth and breathing that was too loud in the quiet. At 0430, they reached the observation post, a foxhole behind a thick hedgerow, maybe 200 yards from where the tiger sat. Close enough to see the target, far enough to maybe survive if things went wrong. Elliot slid into the muddy hole, the control box clutched to his chest like a life preserver. Through a gap in the brush, he could see the crossroads, could see the dark bulk of the tiger, a shadow against shadows. Grease settled beside him, pulled out his cigar. For the first time in 3 weeks, in front of God and Elliot and the approaching dawn, he bit the end off and lit it with his Zippo. The flame illuminated his face for a moment. "You ready for this, Specs?" Elliot's hands were shaking again. "No." "Good answer. Means you're thinking clearly. What if I miss? What if the signal fails? What if—" Grease's hand clamped on his shoulder, firm and warm through the wet fabric. "Listen to me. You're the smartest guy I've ever met. You built a machine that shouldn't exist. You solved problems that had no solutions. You did it in 12 hours with scrap metal and borrowed parts. Trust yourself." In the distance, the tiger's engine coughed. Once, twice, then caught with that deep Maybach rumble that made the ground vibrate under their bodies. Brenner's voice came from behind them. "They're waking up. It's almost time." The sky was lightening in the east. Not sunrise yet, but that grey pre-dawn twilight when the world transitions from darkness to possibility. Elliot positioned the machine at the forward edge of the foxhole, 10 feet ahead in the tall grass. The antenna trembled in the morning breeze. The wheels sat ready on soil that had been farmland for 1,000 years and battlefield for 3 weeks. His thumb hovered over the forward toggle. Behind them, Red Henshaw was still alive, still bleeding, still waiting for a road that was clear enough to evacuate him. 30 men were waiting to find out if they'd see tomorrow. Elliot took a deep breath. The smell was morning dew and gun oil, and the smoke from Grease's cigar. "Show them what American engineering can do," Grease said softly. Elliot pushed the toggle forward. There is a moment in every battle when time itself holds its breath, when the chaos of war compresses down to a single point of absolute focus, when the entire universe consists of you and a target and the invisible thread of connection between. This was that moment. The machine leaped forward with a high-pitched whir that sounded almost harmless, not the roar of artillery, not the rattle of machine guns, just a soft electric hum, like a child's toy waking up on Christmas morning. But this toy was carrying enough explosive to rewrite the morning. It shot out of the tall grass at a speed that made Elliot's breath catch, faster than he'd calculated. The wheels bit into the torn earth, the suspension soaking up the ruts and craters, the electric motors screaming at maximum RPM. 25 miles per hour. 30. Faster. Through the morning mist, the German tank commander stood in the Tiger's turret hatch, binoculars to his eyes. He was scanning the hedgerows for threats his training had taught him to recognize. Sherman tanks, anti-tank guns, bazookas, the standard tools of American assault tactics. He wasn't looking for a toy on wheels. The machine bounced wildly over the rutted ground. Every crater sent it briefly airborne, all four wheels off the earth, then slamming back down with the suspension compressing hard. But it kept going, kept accelerating. 150 yards to target. The German commander lowered his binoculars, frowned, raised them again. Through the lenses, he could see something moving toward his position through the grass. Too small, too fast. Maybe debris blown by morning wind. Maybe an animal. Too absurd to be dangerous. That 3-second window of confusion was everything. "He sees it," Brenner hissed. "Zigzag specks. Don't give him a clean shot." Elliot's hands were slick with sweat on the wooden control box. He flicked the steering dial left. The machine responded instantly, swerving hard. The rear wheels broke traction, the whole vehicle sliding sideways through mud, then catching grip and accelerating again at a new angle. Right. Another swerve. Unpredictable motion. Impossible to lead with a gun sight. 100 yards. The German commander's brain finally processed what his eyes were seeing. Something mechanical, something purposeful, something coming fast and getting closer. He screamed in German, pointing. The hull-mounted MG-42 erupted. 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was like industrial fabric being ripped by a giant. That distinctive burping roar that every soldier in Europe had learned to fear. Tracers streaked through the morning air, phosphorescent green hornets seeking to kill. The ground around the machine exploded in geysers of mud and torn grass. The gunner was walking his fire, learning the lead, compensating for speed and distance. "Left! Hard left!" Grease shouted, forgetting that Elliot couldn't hear him, that only radio waves could command the machine now. But Elliot was already moving, jerking the dial. The machine skidded sideways just as tracers stitched a line through the space it had occupied a heartbeat before. 75 yards. A bullet clipped the rear fender. The impact sent a spray of sparks into the dawn, bright orange against grey. Metal pinged. But the machine kept going, the motors protected inside their housings, the wheels intact, momentum carrying it forward. Elliot's fear had vanished completely, not because he'd become brave, but because there was no room for fear in the pure focus state he'd entered. The world had simplified into mathematics, vectors and velocities, angle of approach and closure rate. He wasn't in the foxhole anymore. He was riding on that chassis, feeling every bump, sensing the traction through some connection that transcended wires and radio waves. 50 yards. The Tiger's massive turret began to traverse, electric motors whining as they tried to bring the 88mm cannon to bear. But the gun was designed for long-range precision, for killing Shermans at 1.5 kilometers, for targets that moved in predictable lines. It wasn't designed for something already inside its effective engagement range and closing at 35 miles per hour. "He can't get the angle," Brenner said, his voice rising. "The geometry's working against him." The physics was perfect, beautiful. The Tiger's main gun could depress 8 degrees below horizontal. At 50 yards, that meant the barrel couldn't aim lower than roughly 9 feet above ground level. The machine was 2 feet tall. Geometry had become a weapon. 40 yards. The MG-42 gunner was good, experienced. He'd learned the lead now, compensating perfectly for the erratic motion. The next burst would connect. Elliot pushed the throttle to maximum. The batteries dumped their remaining charge in one desperate surge. The starter motors went from screaming to shrieking. The machine launched over a small ditch, catching air, all 4 wheels suspended, flying. It looked heroic and absurd. A toy car with delusions of grandeur, airborne against the backdrop of a 56-ton monster. It landed hard, but moving, suspension compressing then rebounding, wheels finding traction, momentum preserved through perfect engineering. 20 yards. The MG-42 fell silent. The gunner had lost his angle. The machine was too close. entering the blind zone beneath the hull gun's minimum depression. The same physics that protected the Tiger from ground threats had become its vulnerability. 15 yards. Through the gap in the hedgerow, Elliot could see details now. The Tiger's armor up close was massive, a wall of welded steel plate. The commander in the turret was young, maybe 22, brown hair, face pale with sudden understanding of what was happening. He was shouting into the intercom, but there was nothing the driver could do. The Tiger couldn't reverse fast enough. The turret couldn't traverse low enough. The weapons couldn't aim at what they couldn't see. 10 yards. The machine wobbled on loose gravel. For one heart-stopping instant, Elliot thought it would flip, would tumble, would miss by inches. But the physics held. The machine slammed into the underside of the Tiger, wedging itself between the massive tracks, tight against the thinnest armor plate on the entire vehicle. The belly. 3.1 inches of steel that had been engineered to protect against mines, not against a precisely delivered 50-pound charge of Composition B. Elliot's hand came off the steering dial. He looked at the red button under its protective cover, the one wired to the radio detonator, the one that would send an electromagnetic signal to a receiver that would close a circuit, that would fire a blasting cap, that would turn metal into superheated gas. His hands weren't shaking. He lifted the cover, pressed the button. The explosion wasn't just sound. It was a physical fact that rewrote the morning. A sphere of orange fire and black smoke erupted from beneath the Tiger, expanding faster than perception. The pressure wave, moving at the speed of sound plus, caught 56.9 tons of German engineering and lifted it. Actually lifted it. The entire tank jumped 2 feet off the ground, all that mass momentarily defying gravity through the brute force of chemical energy converting to kinetic. Time seemed to freeze with the Tiger suspended in mid-air, tracks unspooling, turret shifting on its ring, the whole vehicle captured in a moment of impossible levitation. Then gravity reasserted itself. The Tiger came down hard, but it came down broken. The tracks, each link 30 pounds of hardened steel, snapped like thread under the torsional stress. They whipped away from the drive wheels, flailing like severed tentacles. The turret, no longer properly seated on its bearing ring, tilted at an angle. Turrets were never designed to assume. The entire vehicle listed sideways. The suspension on one side collapsed. Smoke poured from every hatch. Not the blue-grey smoke of diesel exhaust. Black smoke. Oily. The smoke of things burning that were never meant to burn. Ammunition, hydraulic fluid, rubber seals, flesh. The machine gun fell silent. The engine died. The Dragon was dead. Elliot fell back into the mud, the control box slipping from his hands. His ears were ringing, a deep bass tone that he felt in his chest cavity. Through the ringing, he heard a sound that took a moment to identify. Laughter. Grease was laughing. Wild, hysterical, the laughter of a man who expected to die and didn't. He sat in the mud with his cigar clenched in his teeth, laughing until tears cut tracks through the grime on his face. "You did it," he managed between gasps. "You actually did it, you crazy professor bastard." Around them, men emerged from the hedgerows slowly, cautiously, like people who'd been living in a nightmare and couldn't quite believe they were awake. They stood in the sunken lane, staring at the burning wreck, faces slack with disbelief. Nobody cheered. The silence was profound, religious almost. These were men who'd just witnessed the impossible, men who'd been given back their lives when those lives had already been written off as losses. The relief was too deep for celebration. Elliot stared at his empty hands, the hands that had pressed the button, the hands that had killed 5 men. Because there were men inside that Tiger, had been men, past tense now. They weren't monsters, they were somebody's sons, maybe somebody's fathers, men who woke up this morning not knowing it was their last. And he'd killed them with mathematics. "Specs," Grease's hand on his shoulder, firm and grounding. "Look at me." Elliot looked. "They would have killed all 30 of us," Grease said, his voice steady now, serious. "You saved 30 lives, that's the math that matters." "I know, but it still feels like murder." "Yes." "Good, hold on to that. It means you're still human. The day it doesn't bother you, that's when you need to worry. Brenner appeared at the foxhole edge. His Thompson gun hung loose at his side. He looked at Elliot for a long moment, then reached down and straightened the kid's helmet. "You bought us the sunrise, Specs, the whole damn day." He turned to the men behind him. "Get a medical team up here. Red's getting evacuated. Road's clear now." The evacuation took 15 minutes. They loaded Red Henshaw onto a stretcher, moved him carefully through the crossroads, while the Tiger still burned 50 yards away, the smoke column rising straight into the morning sky. The medic said he had a fighting chance now. Not a guarantee, but a chance. Better than he'd had an hour ago. One life saved for certain. 29 more that wouldn't be lost today. The sun broke through the morning mist, casting golden light across the scarred fields. The temperature was climbing again, probably hit 90 by noon, but Elliot barely noticed. He stood at the edge of the crossroads, looking at the scorch mark on the earth where the machine had vaporized itself. All that remained was one bent wheel and the antenna, still standing at an angle, reaching for signals that would never come again. Grease walked over, his cigar somehow still intact. "When we get home, after all this is over, what are you going to do? Back to Caltech?" Elliot cleaned his glasses on his sleeve. The crack in the lens caught the light. "I don't know. I don't think I want to build things that just sit there anymore." "What then?" "Machines. Machines that can go where people shouldn't. That can take the bullet so men like you don't have to." Grease was quiet for a moment. "That's a good dream, Specs." He pulled out a crushed pack of cigarettes. "You build them. I'll fix them. Deal?" "Deal." They stood together in the morning light, two men who'd been strangers yesterday and brothers today, connected by 12 hours of desperate creation and 47 seconds of controlled destruction. Brenner came over, holding the bent antenna. "This goes to ordnance. Washington needs to see what's possible when you give smart men enough motivation." The war didn't stop for miracles. The battalion moved forward, securing the crossroads, pushing toward the next objective. By noon, the 29th Infantry Division had advanced 3 miles. By evening, Saint-Lô was within artillery range, and somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of the United States Army, a report began to circulate. A report about an unauthorized field modification that had achieved results conventional weapons couldn't match. Nobody knew it yet, but they'd just witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare. Epilogue. The Echo. 70 years is long enough for the world to forget almost anything. Long enough for young men to become old, for old men to become memories, for memories to become museums. The National Museum of American History, Washington, D.C., April 2014. In a glass case in the World War II Innovations Wing, there's a wooden model, crude, hand-painted, clearly built by someone working fast with limited materials. 4 wheels, rectangular chassis, an antenna made from coat hanger wire bent into shape. The placard reads, "First radio-controlled combat vehicle, July 9, 1944, Normandy, France. Designed, PFC Elliott Whitmore, Caltech. Constructed, Sergeant Hank Kellerman, 29th Infantry Division. Result, 1 Tiger tank destroyed, 30 lives saved. Operational lifespan, 47 seconds. An elderly man stands in front of the case, 88 years old, still wearing thick glasses, though the prescription has changed many times over the decades. He uses a cane, though he'd argue he doesn't need it. His jacket has an embroidered patch, 29th Infantry Division, Omaha Beach, European Theatre. A younger visitor, maybe 30, stops beside him, reads the placard, frowns. 47 seconds? They built it overnight and it only lasted 47 seconds? The old man doesn't turn. We had 11 hours, used scrap metal, salvaged parts, desperation and mathematics. Still, 47 seconds seems like not much. Now the old man turns, looks at the visitor with eyes that have seen things museums can't capture. 47 seconds was enough time to cover 200 yards. Dodge machine gun fire, reach a target conventional weapons couldn't touch, kill a Tiger tank that had killed 2 Shermans that morning. He taps the glass gently. 47 seconds changed everything. The visitor studies the old man's face. Recognition dawns slowly. You were there. I built that. These hands. Elliot holds up his hands, spotted with age now but still steady, in a barn with no roof, while good men were dying. My friend Hank did the welding. I did the wiring. Together we made impossible into possible. Did your friend? Did he make it home? Elliot's face clouds. Hank Kellerman was killed 4 months later. Battle of Hurtgen Forest, November 1944. Never got to see his daughters grow up. Never got to build the machines we talked about building together. He pauses. But he lived long enough to know this mattered. The visitor doesn't know what to say to that, so he just nods respectfully and moves on to the next exhibit. Elliot stays at the case, thinking about numbers, the important numbers, the ones that don't appear on placards. 30 men saved that morning. Those 30 men came home when the war ended, got married, had children. 72 children total, according to the Veterans Association records Elliot had checked. Those 72 grew up in the America their fathers fought for, became teachers, doctors, farmers, engineers, had their own children, 215 grandchildren. Those grandchildren had children. 480 great-grandchildren at last count, though the number was probably higher now. Do the arithmetic. 30 plus 72 plus 215 plus 480. 797 people. Nearly 800 lives that existed because on July 9th, 1944, a scared college kid and a Detroit foreman refused to accept that physics couldn't beat a Tiger tank. How many of those 800 had saved other lives? The doctors treating patients, the teachers educating the next generation, the parents raising children who'd save others in turn. The numbers spiraled outward like ripples from a stone, impossible to calculate, impossible to quantify, but absolutely real. Elliot walks slowly through the museum, cane tapping on polished floors, past other exhibits, other moments when desperate men made miracles happen. He reaches the modern warfare section. The displays here are different, sleek, advanced. A bomb disposal robot behind glass, all titanium and sensors and sophisticated electronics. Next to it, a reconnaissance drone, remote weapon systems. The technology has evolved beyond anything he could have imagined in that barn, but the principle remains: metal instead of flesh, machines taking risks humans shouldn't. On a screen, footage plays from recent conflicts. A robot approaching a suspicious package on a street in Baghdad. The operator is somewhere else, somewhere safe, controlling it remotely. The same concept. 70 years later. The same thumb movement Elliot made in a French foxhole. He watches the robot complete its mission, neutralize the threat, roll back to safety, watches soldiers walk away alive because of it. Somewhere, in a secure facility, a young operator guides a drone through a street half a world away. 22 years old. Same age Elliot was. The drone identifies an IED before a patrol reaches it, marks it for disposal. The patrol alters route. 12 soldiers keep walking. They don't know about Elliot Whitmore, don't know about a broke Jeep in Normandy, don't know about Hank Kellerman welding at midnight in a roofless barn. But they're alive because of it, because every technology has ancestors, every innovation stands on desperate solutions that came before. The machine drove for 47 seconds in July of 1944. But in a way that transcends time and space, it's still driving, still zigzagging through the bullets, still carrying courage on 4 wheels, still proving that giants can fall. Elliot walks out of the museum into Washington afternoon. The sun is warm, the air smells of nothing in particular, no cordite, no crushed apples, no burning steel, just spring in America. Clean and safe and bought with blood 70 years ago. He thinks about Hank, buried in France, never made it home to Detroit, but in his 4 months of life after that morning, Hank had written to his wife, told her about the machine they'd built, told her it mattered. His wife kept the letters, showed them to their daughters. The daughters showed them to their children.
3 of Hank Kellerman's grandchildren became engineers. One works for Boston Dynamics building robots.
Another designs remote surgical systems. The third develops autonomous vehicles. Hank's hands, which welded the frame in a barn in Normandy, echo forward through his descendants' work. Building things that save lives. Building things that go where people can't. The circle completing itself in ways nobody could have predicted. Elliot takes the metro back to his apartment in Silver Spring. On the train, he sees a young woman, maybe 25, reading a textbook on electrical engineering, probably a student at Maryland or Georgetown. She's focused, making notes in the margins, completely absorbed in whatever problem she's trying to solve. He wants to tell her, someday, maybe soon, maybe years from now, that problem you're solving will save someone's life, maybe many lives. You won't know whose, won't know when, but the work matters. Instead, he just smiles and lets her study in peace. That night, in his apartment surrounded by 70 years of accumulated memories and photographs and medals he never wanted but couldn't refuse, Elliot sits at his desk and opens his old notebook from Caltech, the one with the original sketches, the one he carried through France and Germany and the end of the war. The pages are yellowed now, fragile, but the drawings are still clear. The machine. Junior, though they'd never called it that until later, until the reports needed a name. He turns to a blank page near the end, uncaps a pen, writes in handwriting that shakes more than it used to, but is still legible. The loudest sound in war isn't the explosion. It's the silence after, when you realize your equations worked and you're still breathing. In that silence, if you listen carefully, you can hear something else. The whir of electric motors, quiet but persistent, carrying hope through the decades, refusing to let good men die when there's another way. 47 seconds, but the echo lasts forever.
He closes the notebook, turns off the light, goes to bed knowing that somewhere, right now, a robot is saving a life he'll never know about. And that's enough. That's more than enough.